Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and welcome to another edition of RegWatch on GFN.TV. Around the world, governments insist their nicotine policies are evidence-based. But when you examine the justifications behind flavor bans, vape prohibitions, public use restrictions, and punitive taxation, you find cherry-picked evidence, spurious correlations presented as fact, and alarming claims that the underlying research does not support. Joining us today to debunk the myths shaping safer nicotine policy is Dr. Ian Fearon, an independent research scientist with decades of experience in tobacco science and harm reduction. Dr. Fearon has published extensively in the field of tobacco science and has contributed to regulatory submissions across multiple jurisdictions and has spent decades examining how scientific evidence is interpreted and misinterpreted in public health policy. Dr. Fearon, welcome back to RegWatch.
Thank you for inviting me again, Brent.
Before we begin, a quick note to our viewers. Today's episode is part 2 of our 2-part conversation with Dr. Fearon. Part 1 is available on the regulatorwatch.com website, YouTube, Facebook, and X. Dr. Fearon, when you were last on RegWatch, you were very direct. You said parts of tobacco control are rejecting or sidelining evidence that doesn't support their policy goals. Is that still the case today?
I certainly think so, and I think the environment is either staying the same or possibly even getting worse. And we're seeing good science which is being ignored, and we're seeing a proliferation, an increasing proliferation of poor quality science which is being used to drive government regulatory policies on vaping products, nicotine pouches, and heated tobacco.
What are some of the worst examples of this?
There are many examples, and it's hard to think about which ones are the worst. I think there are two things that I could look at here. One is restricting the publication of scientific data because of somebody's either apparent or alleged conflicts of interest. And I think that's stifling science, it's stifling the publication of science, it's stifling informing smokers that there are a less harmful alternative out there that they could switch to using. And increasingly we're seeing scientific societies, peer-reviewed journals, who have bans on either the industry or anybody linked to industry in publishing their scientific data. And even in those journals that don't have de facto bans, we're beginning to see it increasingly in the peer review process, where it seems that you're not allowed to have an open mind, and you're criticized for having a viewpoint regardless of the facts that you describe in your publication. So it's almost a censorship of a view which doesn't conform with those within tobacco control. And the other side is the evidence, if you like, that does get published in peer-reviewed journals and then, of course, makes its way into the mainstream media. Even low-quality science reaches newspapers across the world, social media sites across the world, and it proliferates very, very quickly, regardless of the quality of the science that was actually conducted, and regardless of whether the conclusions of that science are actually supported by the findings. So I think that there are the two things. It's stifling research because of apparent conflicts of interest, and it's promoting research even though it's fundamentally flawed and doesn't find what it concludes to find.
I'm trying to get an understanding, Dr. Fearon, if we're dealing with simple misinterpretations of science or some mistakes that they might be making, or is it something more deliberate?
It's hard for me to say that it's something more deliberate in the absence of any factual information that there is, some driver of why people are, why scientists are publishing poor quality data, which from experiments which clearly aren't designed to get at the truth. It would be hard for me to say that, because I haven't seen any direct evidence of that. And I think misinterpretation, I don't think it is misinterpretation when somebody publishes a paper where their data says one thing, but the conclusion section says another. I think it's hard to say that's an accident, that it's a mistake. And I see a lot of examples of this. There was a paper published just yesterday which had looked at the gateway effect, and it had taken all of the scientific studies published today on the so-called gateway effect, i.e. that non-smokers start using vaping products and then they start smoking combustible cigarettes. And it taken all of these studies and done a systematic review, and the end of the results section said all of the evidence that we have assessed is at risk of bias and is of poor quality. And then the first conclusion says, we provide evidence that vaping products provide a gateway to cigarette smoking. Now, those two things are clearly at odds with one another, and they're juxtaposed to one another in a scientific publication. It's misinterpretation at worst, but something more deliberate, I guess, is probably what we're looking at.
So, yeah, it's tough. You don't want to believe that there are scientists out there who are consciously trying to mislead, but that paper is either total sloppiness and complete incompetence or deliberate.
And it's hard to know which it is, and it could be a mistake, but mistakes like that shouldn't get through the peer review process. A peer reviewer should have picked that up and said, hey, you can't make that statement because of what you just said in the sentence before. You might want to revise that. So it's almost, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's also that, you get this feeling that the system is broken on so many levels, from the scientific studies, from the writing of them, from the peer review process, from the reporting in the mainstream media. It's all skewed towards sensationalism and to reiterating the mantra that all novel nicotine products are bad and need to be banned wherever they're currently sold. It's hard to, I don't like using the word conspiracy, but there must be something else at play here.
So there's cultural kind of hysteria, and there's propaganda. And sometimes propaganda doesn't need to be a conspiracy. It just needs to fit the cultural hysteria and other forms of narrative forming, right?
I think that's probably part of it. And, when I was an academic before I started working on tobacco harm reduction 18 years ago, I was an academic. And the one thing academics need is research funding. Without research funding, you don't have a lab and you don't have a career. And I think it's easy to fall into that trap of, well, let's just carry on saying the things that I know will get me research funding, as opposed to uncovering the truth. And I know that if I publish that, then I won't get any more research funding. And I think that's potentially one of the drivers. Academic promotion is another driver. That are all kind of pushing into this post-truth world of let's just keep the status quo. Let's just say what we think the funding agencies and my university dean wants to hear, what the newspapers say that the readers want to read. And let's publish that. And I think that's sad in many, many respects, because it forgets that there is a toll of such information, and that toll is adult smokers who will die young because they think the less harmful alternative is actually equally harmful, and they don't switch.
Dr. Fearon, at this year's Global Forum on Nicotine, you're hosting a workshop titled Evidence-Based Policy, Debunking Myths Used to Support Prohibition. Tell us about that.
So as I keep saying, we live in this kind of post-truth world, and I wanted to, help set the record in some respects. And so the idea is that in this workshop, we will use some of the common myths that are used to support nicotine prohibition, and we will try and debunk them, not using opinion, not using fake news. We will debunk them using scientific publications and data from rigorous studies. And so, for example, we'll look at things like the myth that vaping doesn't help people quit smoking, or vaping causes heart disease. And we will present scientific evidence that goes against those nicotine prohibition myths. And the kind of the bigger picture aim is so that those advocating in countries across the world, in front of regulators across the world, those advocating to for governments to set regulation which is permissive to novel tobacco and nicotine products can have the scientific evidence, the facts that they need to go in front of regulators, to go in front of scientific ministers, and to argue for less restrictive regulatory environments for novel products.
Is the term evidence-based policy being stretched beyond recognition?
It has, and I was thinking about this earlier, and it's a bit of a buzzword. That we've assessed the evidence. We're setting an evidence-based policy, but I think you're right to question what exactly does that mean. I think it should be fact-based policy, and I think what regulators get caught up in, there are just a huge number of publications. Literally thousands of papers a year looking at novel tobacco and nicotine products. And as a regulator, you're faced with making a decision based on assimilating all of the findings from those publications. And I think the easiest thing to do is go to the conclusion and think, this is a good scientific journal, it's been peer reviewed, I'll use that conclusion as my evidence. But to me, that isn't evidence. That's just somebody's view based on the study that they've conducted. What that regulator needs to do is look at the data within that publication and make their own conclusions. And there are many, many examples I could give where the data tables within a publication are very, very different from the conclusions which are drawn from those data.
Okay, so I want to talk about cherry picking the science. And at first, when I brought this up, it was more like tobacco control, cherry picking reports and scientific reports to amplify it, or media or NGOs or, Bloomberg's people. But let's focus this for a second, because based on what you just said, a report's author may actually indeed cherry pick their own evidence in the report to come up with the conclusion they want to write.
That's correct. And I think that cherry picking doesn't just come from the examination of the data. I think it's more fundamental than that. It comes from the design of the study as well. And I think often you see people designing studies badly, for example, looking at the toxicology of e-cigarette vapor, but not comparing it to cigarette smoke, but comparing it to fresh air, which is an irrelevant comparison. Or using a vaping product to the extreme, so that it does start producing, toxic chemicals because it's used in a way that no vapor would ever use it. But that drives a toxicological response. So that's what we use in our study. So that in itself is cherry picking. It's cherry picking how you will do the experiment that you want to do, rather than doing it properly with the appropriate controls. But I think the other bit of the cherry picking is looking at the data and cherry picking the findings that you present, and then which make your conclusions and then make newspaper headlines. And a great example of this, and I use this quite often, is a paper that looked at the likelihood of developing lung disease, high blood pressure, having a stroke amongst vapers, exclusive e-cigarette users, and amongst never users of electronic cigarettes. And what they saw was that amongst the exclusive vapers, the likelihood of developing lung disease, COPD, was significantly higher than it was amongst never vapers, right? And so the headline was, vaping causes lung disease. But what you actually see if you look in the data tables from that paper is that the likelihood of developing lung disease in vapers was half the likelihood as it was in cigarette smokers. And if you use the assumption, and this is based on evidence, that the majority of e-cigarette users used to smoke combustible cigarettes and 90% of vapers are former smokers, what that actually shows you is that switching from cigarette smoking to exclusive use of an electronic cigarette cuts your risk of lung disease in half. I mean, can you believe that? That, to me, should be the newspaper headline. Not vaping causes lung disease, but vaping reduces your likelihood of lung disease by 50%.
So that is incredible. I wonder what the damage that kind of approach, this cherry picking approach, causes.
I think we see the damage every year that organisations such as Action on Smoking and Health in the UK publish their annual report on vaping and smoking in the UK. And one of the things that they ask people every year is, what are your views on the risk of vaping? Is it less harmful than smoking, equally harmful, or more harmful? And what we've seen over the last decade is an increase in the number of people who think that vaping is more harmful or as harmful as smoking, and a decrease in the number of people who think that vaping is less harmful. So clearly, the public perception is getting worse, and it's a mirror image of the actual reality. And I think that is the damage that's being done, and it's preventing smokers from switching to something that could reduce their likelihood of lung disease, heart disease, and cancer.
And from what I understand, the group that actually holds the largest misperception about the health impacts of vaping being harmful are actually smokers who have never vaped.
That's absolutely true. And you know, they are the people that we should be investing most in. You know, that those people who maybe tried a vaping product a decade ago when, you know, they were poor quality disposable products, unlike the products that we have now, which have a much cleaner vapor and deliver nicotine more effectively. You know, those are the people that we need to stop from smoking cigarettes. And typically, those people who haven't tried vaping products yet are older smokers as well. It's almost like we have a forgotten generation. The older smoker, you know, we don't really care. Well, I say we, they don't really care about them anymore. But they're the people who can benefit the most from switching to a nicotine alternative.
Now, if those people actually, though, are in the US where they've run wild with this abuse liability issue, the products that are going to best be able to help replace cigarette smoking for them are considered to be the worst to put on the market.
And that's true. And you know, and I think that stems from the regulator in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, having a view that addiction to nicotine is a disease, and they don't separate, which in my view they should, addiction with smoking-related disease. I think in FDA's eyes, they are two things that they want to eradicate. And I don't think they see the middle ground, which is, if we could get a smoker addicted to nicotine, but in the absence of all the toxic chemicals which are causing them harm, that's a massive public health win. And I think FDA don't necessarily adhere to that view. And we have seen that with some marketing denial orders for products which deliver nicotine too effectively, in essence, which deliver nicotine just like a cigarette. And FDA said, no, we don't like that. That product is too addictive. You're just swapping one addiction for another, and we won't allow it to be marketed.
Dr. Fearon, we often see correlation presented as causation. What are the dangers around that?
I think the dangers are it doesn't reveal the truth. You know, to look at whether A causes B, you have to recruit people at A and follow them up until they get to B and see what happened in the interim. If you just look at what happened at A and what happened at B, you can form a conclusion, which is just based on a correlation. You know, and we see this a lot. And the example I gave earlier of lung disease amongst people who exclusively use electronic cigarettes, but who used to be former smokers, the correlation is that vaping is correlated with an increased prevalence of lung disease, right? That's a correlation. But the causation was cigarette smoking prior to initiating e-cigarette use. So by looking at correlations and not causation, you are actually fundamentally missing the truth completely.
Dr. Fearon, even when a claim seems wildly overstated on its face, it still gets broadcast and repeated across the media and in tobacco control circles. Why is that?
I think it's what in the UK we call rubbernecking. When there's an accident on the highway and everybody slows down to kind of have a look at what happened. And I think that's the same with the media. Newspapers don't get sold by vaping saved my grandma and she lived to the age of 92. That's not a news story. Vaping killed my 18-year-old son through popcorn lung, which is a myth, by the way. I have to add, I'm making this up. That sells way more newspapers than vaping helped save my 92-year-old grandmother's life. And I think that's the reality that we live in. It's all about clickbait and revenue from advertisements, which sells social media, which sells newspapers. And so the greater the story, the greater the clickbait, and seemingly everyone's a winner, apart from the poor smokers who don't know the truth.
So to bring this back a bit to your workshop at GFN coming up this June, how does these kinds of myths support the call for prohibition?
It's hard for me to answer that question because I don't see that they do. I hear arguments like vaping products don't help people quit smoking, yet we have 4 or 5 years now of independent Cochrane reviews that says there is high quality evidence that vaping is better at helping people quit smoking than nicotine replacement therapy. So, the myth is at complete odds with the actual fact published by an independent research group. I hear things like, well, we already have products, nicotine replacement therapy products, which help people stop smoking. And, the reality is that even the best pharmacological agents to help smokers quit only help 1 in 5 smokers to stop smoking. There are some studies with Juul that show 40 to 50% complete switching rate. That's 2.5 times better than the best available prescription medicine. So again, the myth that we have products already, we don't need vaping products and pouches, is completely not supported by the literature. So I honestly, in my own mind as a scientist, can't join the myth with the reality. It's just at odds with all the scientific evidence that I know of.
Let me ask you, has tobacco control become merchants of doubt?
I certainly think so, and I don't know if this is recently or that I've noticed this or that I have become maybe a little bit immune to it. But you see this line of, and this is the biggest transmitter of the merchant of doubt, is we just don't have enough long-term evidence, right? And I mean, I've actually heard that recently with nicotine pouches. And if you think that nicotine pouches are very similar in terms of nicotine delivery profile and in terms of composition to Swedish snus, then you think, well, actually, we have decades of epidemiological evidence on those things, on pouches that you put in your mouth. But I see that all the time for vaping products, particularly. We just don't have enough long-term evidence. But I'm like, how much evidence do you need? These things contain a fraction of the toxins that cigarette smoke has, if at all. Things like formaldehyde, acrolein, carbon monoxide. These things are pretty much absent from any modern vaping product. There's bucket loads of these toxins in cigarette smoke. Why do you need long-term evidence to suggest that that vaping product will be less harmful than cigarette smoking? It doesn't make sense.
Dr. Fearon, as you know, the 13th edition of the Global Forum on Nicotine, the annual conference on safer nicotine products and tobacco harm reduction, takes place again this year in Warsaw, Poland, from June 3 to 5, 2026. The conference theme is Prohibition and Public Health. In your mind, is there a public health consensus on nicotine prohibition?
I don't think there is a consensus. And because there are two completely polarized opposites in terms of one side of the public health debate saying novel tobacco and nicotine products are the answer, which will cure cigarette smoking. And the other half are saying, no, these are just an invention of the evil tobacco industry. They should be banned. They get kids hooked into a lifetime of nicotine addiction. They're just as harmful as cigarette smoking. So we have these two complete polar opposites. And I think what's sad is that those two opposites at the moment are just stuck as complete polar opposites. And those with one view won't talk to the other, and those with that view won't talk to the other side either. So it's almost like we never will reach a consensus until people just come together and start talking with one another. And I think one sad thing that actually happened this year, and I met Scott on a number of occasions, was the passing of Scott Ballin suddenly over Christmas this year. And Scott was an immensely powerful individual in getting those with polar views in the same room and talking to one another. And that to me is a huge loss. And that will only, I think, help to prevent the coming together of the people with those polar opposite views.
So looking at maybe how to fix this, what are some of the solutions to address this prohibitionist thinking that has come to dominate at least public health policy?
I mean, how to fix it is in a system which I think is so fundamentally flawed. It's like going to a scrapyard with and looking at cars that have been completely written off and trying to fix the horn and claiming that you can sell the car to somebody. It's almost an impossibility at this stage. If I had a wish list, I think I would love people to get back to what we were taught as young scientists, in our early teens onwards throughout our scientific careers, that science is all about hypothesis testing. It's not about proving yourself right or proving yourself wrong. It's about hypothesis testing. And what we need to do is to set hypotheses and test them through rigorous scientific research. And if we get the answer that contrasts with our preformed view of the world, then so be it. If we test a hypothesis and it fails, go find another hypothesis to test. That's how science should work. But that's not what's being done right now. It's all about, I have a view on the world, I'm going to prove myself right. And if I prove myself right 100 times, I cannot be wrong. Whereas true scientific research is the exact opposite. You set out to prove yourself wrong. And only when you have exhausted all avenues of proving yourself wrong, you might actually be right, but you will never know because there might be a tool that you haven't used yet. And I think that's where we need to get back to, is that fundamental of scientific research. Test the hypothesis, keep testing the hypothesis and see what you find.